The title is Co-Designing Virtual Scenarios for Learning, which I'm sure happens a lot anyway, but this is really about designing also the knowledge building around developing these kinds of scenarios for medical education students. Overall, I'm going to go through a theory-based design for learning because I know from discussions with Terry and Sheetal that the conversational framework, which I developed many years ago, to really help educators understand what we could do with digital that we couldn't do with conventional methods. And so I wanted to say a bit about that because it's so fundamental when we're thinking about what technology can do for education, to think about what education needs from the technology. So we really have to start with a clear analysis of what we want from the technology. And then we'll use it better, we'll critique it better, and we'll demand more, which we certainly need. But then there's the issue of, so what does this actually mean for scenario-based learning? And then I want to end by talking about how we share exemplars to improve learning designs. Starting with theory-based design for learning, this is about where we begin to think about what is the learner doing when they're learning in the context of formal education, and how do we, as teachers, make that happen? And the conversational framework, as I said, was developed some years ago, but has been updated more recently, deriving from the theories and research which are being done on learning and teaching in general, as well as in the context of technology. And it's designed to represent the teaching learning process, to give us a sort of handy framework to think with as we think about how we design teaching. And it sees that process as being a series of iterative changes between the learner and the teacher on the one hand, and the learner and their peers on the other hand, and then at two levels of concept and practice, or theory and experience. And that, I don't think we can do anything simpler than that. It's complicated enough just thinking through it like that. So I'm going to try and explain where it comes from and what we can do with it. If we're thinking about what it takes for the learner to learn in the context of formal education, this is a very simplistic picture of a learner learning. And they will have concepts and they'll have practices. And what we try to do is to develop those. And the learner concepts, we hope, will keep processing and developing over time. And the learner practice, we hope, will keep developing over time. And most importantly, we want the links between those two to be developing over time. So in that sense, we're seeing learning as being an iterative process of constantly processing and reprocessing how we think about what we're doing in terms of both the conceptual theory that we're learning about, the way we think about it, and all the way we put that into practice, and the way we use practice to help develop our concepts further. So it's those iterative processes fundamental to learning. And we've got to help us with that. We have the teacher on the one hand, and the teacher is operating at the level of concepts, and the teacher concepts will be given to us through a teacher communication cycle, represented through both human teachers and books and libraries and webcasts and videos and all kinds of things. So the teacher concepts are represented in a variety of different ways. And the learning environment is what the teacher sets up in order for the student to learn. So a scenario-based learning game, for example, would be such a learning environment. It might also be a book, it might be a worksheet, it might be all kinds of things. But that's up to the teacher to create the learning environment in which the learner can practice those concepts. On the other hand, there's also peers, and interacting with peers is very important because that peer communication cycle will also help those concepts to develop as you explain, debate, negotiate ideas. And with peer practice, being able to share practice, see what other people make of the same problem sheet or the same analysis of a particular situation, all of those things are very important to learners as they're going through. The teacher isn't with them all the time. So that's the basic framework. And onto that, we can then map a number of different types of learning. There's only 6. And what I've tried to do is to shoehorn everything that we do in terms of types of learning into those 6, because we can't remember more than 6. Learning through acquisition is probably the most commonplace and ubiquitous form of learning that we do in human learning, because we're learning through that communication of ideas, and we have the incredible advantage that we can do that, whether it's through books or lectures or whatever. The black lines mean that's something which is coming into the learner, and the red arrows are what the learner is doing in processing. And as we listen to people, as you watch and listen, there'll be something going on in there, but not as much as if you're learning through something like inquiry, which is generated by the learner. That's when you generate a question to the teacher, for example. So that's an active part of the processing. The teacher will respond with something, or the book will tell you something, and then those wheels start to turn. So you can learn through inquiry through those repetitive cycles in that way. And it's importantly different from learning through acquisition, because the learner is pushing it along and more is happening. Then learning through practice, there will be some kind of learning environment set up with a task goal for the student, who then has to respond with some practice, does something and gets some feedback, and then carries on around that practice, developing their practice until it comes to a point when they're not doing it as well as they could, and they need to start recruiting the conceptual understanding into improving the practice, which then feeds back through again into the theoretical understanding. So one of the things we're doing when we set up a learning environment is trying to engage that conceptual thinking, not just getting them doing things, but also thinking about what they're doing. And then the peers, discussion, of course, is very important, and you'll think of something to say to a peer, or ask a peer, or comment on, and the peer will give something back to you. It might be a question or a challenge, and then you've got to do something with that. So again, that cycle invites you to do some important learning processing. Not as much as you have to do in collaborative learning. In collaborative learning, each individual learner is doing that practice processing, but then they get to the point where they get a bit stuck, or they need some help, or they want another point of view. And so you go to the conceptual part, where you have a discussion now with your peers who offer something, offer an opinion, challenge your thinking. And then you have to go round that cycle again to try collaborating, but this time you might share something with a peer. And that sharing process enables even more cyclical process of learning to come about. So learning through collaboration is complex. That's why we think it's important. So that continual processing is one of the things that helps the concepts and the practice to develop, and to develop in concert with each other. Finally, learning through production, which again is ubiquitous. We all ask students to represent what they've learned, articulate what they've learned, and represent to us and to themselves what they've learned by producing something. And that means they've got to think about what they've learned, what that relationship is between their concepts and their experience, and represent it somehow. Might be something as simple as an answer to a teacher's question. It might be something as simple as that, but it could also be a 5,000-word essay, or a thesis, or a computer program, or a diagnosis in a clinical situation. So those are the 6 types of learning, and basically I think we can hang everything that we do in formal education on that framework, both conventional and digital. And part of any theory of learning design has to be, therefore, to design the support we can to elicit each type of learning, to keep those cycles of processing churning as much as possible. Just to interpret it in terms of conventional methods, which will be familiar to everybody, learning through acquisition, reading, watching, or listening. You're, for example, watching what the teacher is doing on the blackboard. In inquiry, you send the students to the library. For practicing, there's answers at the back of the book through a set of textbook questions, or there's a game that you play in the context of a student group. Discussion, well, we put students in discussion groups. And collaboration, you send people off to work in pairs or groups on the lab, or do a joint project together. And for production, you write an essay and various other kinds of things. So we can certainly hang all of our conventional methods on that. For digital methods, we've got a whole lot more. You can watch a screencast, you can search the internet, you can use a virtual tool, you can use a discussion online forum, create a joint digital product, make an animation. All kinds of things we can do, and there are many more. That's a picture from a UCL MOOC on dementia. That's a website used in geography to get students thinking about climate change, and you can look at an interactive weather map. That's from NASA, and it helps you recognize the waveform of, I think it's meteorites, asteroids, that's right, asteroids. And it's quite difficult, even though it's multiple choice, it's quite hard to do that. I recommend it. It's quite fun. For discussion groups, you can do those online. You can do it in webcasts, web seminars, webinars, and so on. Creating a joint product, you can get students to create a digital representation of a project that they've done, or work on a project together and represent that, and maybe represent what they've done in terms of learning as an animation. This would be an animation of the water cycle. You might get students to produce an animation of the circulation of blood, for example, because it's a bit more challenging to do that than it is to simply write an essay about it or write something down on a piece of paper. You've got to make the thing actually work. So all of those are the same kinds of learning types, but they are encouraged through a wide variety of digital methods. And the problem that we all have now is to make the best of all of those digital methods. So in essence, theory-based design for learning means that we have to think about considering what it takes to encourage the iterative process of learning, of both reflection and analysis as we get students working through what we've prepared for them. How do we get those cycles of conceptual development, practice development, and the relationship between them really working? Then the next section comes to looking at what does this mean for scenario-based learning. And here I'm going to focus on contrasting types of digital feedback because it's come up once or twice this morning. What you're really doing in getting students to work through an analysis of a clinical situation and practice that, and what kind of feedback they get, which then enables them to learn. What does that amount to? The types of digital feedback, for example, multiple choice questions, you can represent on that same framework by saying what the teacher does is set up a learning environment, some kind of exercise or activity. They set a task for the learner has to generate some actions. Then, when they've made some choice, the teacher has to analyze that choice, the teacher now being the program, and provide some feedback or guidance. And based on the feedback, whether it's right or wrong, or some kind of hint as to what the answer should be, the learner then generates a new action and gets some more feedback and guidance and goes around that cycle. So that feedback is extrinsic to their action. It's not seeing what happens, like the example that JB was showing us this morning of the toddler playing with a pile of bricks, and you put the large blue one on top and the whole thing falls apart, and you figure out you've got to do something a bit differently. That's how we learn through practice in the world. But here, we're getting someone else's, the teachers, the program's analysis of what's happened as a result of our action. It's wrong, we've made the wrong choice, and now you've got this. And the problem with that is that there is not the same kind of opportunity to reflect and analyze what's going on. If you look at that analysis there, there's nothing that feeds back up into making the learner's conceptual process change particularly. You're just reacting to what you've just been told to do, and you have another go. There is that danger. Of course, some students will work hard at multiple choice questions, but it's easy for them just to work through kind of guessing. If you look at interactive methods which create a model or scenario, then the task is given and the learner has to generate some kind of action, and they'll get feedback on the basis of what they did. So this is intrinsic. And then they will have to think about, if they're getting it wrong, what they have to do to improve that action. So as they're thinking about this new kind of action, they're beginning to pull together both the concepts and the practice, because they're not being given any kind of hint by the teacher, and they're not having to simply choose another option. So when you're working with a digital model, it could be climate change, or it could be a model of the way the heart operates, and you're trying to change the blood pressure so that something works in a different way. You've got to keep working with those input parameters in order to make the model work better. So that's much more like the kinds of things we do in certain areas in real life. It's intrinsic feedback. If I were to pick an example, it wouldn't be a child with building blocks, because you might just put the big blue one on top and then the whole thing falls apart. You think maybe it was because it was blue it went wrong, not because it was big it went wrong. An example might be if you're trying to kick a ball through a football goal and you kick it and it goes a bit too far to the left and you miss. You've got information on that about what you do to improve that practice next time. You've got to hit a bit more to the right than you did before. Something like that. It's intrinsic to that action, and you know something about what you've got to do to improve it. And that's what a model or a scenario will give you if it's giving you feedback on what happened as a result of your action. So there's a lot of processing going on for the student there. So those contrasting types of feedback show you the difference between the extrinsic feedback, which tells you you didn't do so well there, that was right or wrong, and the intrinsic feedback, where you have information about what you need to do to improve it. So the extrinsic feedback is a bit like somebody standing on the sidelines where you're trying to hit the ball through the goal, and you're blindfolded, and you hit it, and they say, no, that's wrong, try again. And you hit it, and they say, no, that's wrong, try again. It's not that helpful. So I want to give you a sense of what this is like by putting you in the situation of trying to learn something. And what you're trying to learn here is the numerical order of the English alphabet. So it's, it's something everyone can do. And hopefully there'll be a kind of experience of what it's like to be asked the question, what is the number for P? Is it the 14th, 15th, or 16th letter? And so you say, well, I think it's the 15th. And you get, no, wrong, try again. What is the number for P? And all you can do, really, is just guess one of the other two. So it invites guessing. There's no encouragement to analyze. There's no encouragement to reflect on your answer, particularly. Just have another go. Then if we look at concealed multiple choice questions, now the important thing about concealed multiple choice questions is you can still use your multiple choice questions, which I know in medicine you have a lot of, but you conceal them first. And I think this is something that somebody referred to as actually doing in the context of a scenario. You ask the open question first, which is the number of the letter U? And let's say you figure out it's 22. And what it tells you, what it then asks you to do is say which is closest to your answer, which is closest to your answer. Because if you then try 23, as you think is pretty close, and it says, no, that's the number for W, so now you've got some informational feedback, because you know it goes UVW, so you can pretty much figure out from that what the correct answer should be. So this reduces guessing. I mean, you could still guess, because you've got a couple of choices left, but it encourages you to analyze, it encourages you to reflect and work out, because it's giving you enough informational feedback that you can work it out for yourself. So that kind of response is importantly different, pedagogically speaking, in terms of how many times round those loops the learner brain is actually working. And then thinking about constructionism, which is where you're actually trying to do it for yourself without any kinds of choices. If I were to ask you which is the number for J, and you have a go at saying 8, and I say, no, that's the number for H, and then you can, so okay, it's IJ, J, IJ, HIJ, and so therefore it must be 10. Okay. So this is important because it doesn't invite guessing, and it's encouraging the student to work it out, to analyze it, to do some work, and that's what makes the wheels go round. So if we contrast those three types of feedback then, multiple choice questions just with that kind of right-wrong feedback and maybe a hint, invites guessing. Concealed multiple choice questions reduce guessing. Constructions, there's no guessing at all. You've got to think it out for yourself each time. Multiple choice questions, there's no processing goes on there, for the other two at least invite processing, analysis and reflection. No particularly helpful feedback from multiple choice questions. Informational feedback, like, no, you didn't get that right, that's the number for W, what's the number for U? That's informational feedback. And which is closest to your answer also means you're not guessing quite so much. Whereas with the constructions, you're always producing your own answer. You're never getting anybody else's answers. So the big pedagogical problem with multiple choice questions is that you're having to think about wrong answers. And you do that processing to think about why, I don't know, if it's about which causes the other, thunder causes lightning or lightning causes thunder, you're thinking, well, I think it's thunder causes lightning because sound travels slowly, and so it's going to get there afterwards, even though it looks like it happens before, and it's the clouds and weather systems impacting, that's what creates the noise. So that's what creates the flash. And so you've got this nice bit of processing you've done to say why it should be that wrong answer. And then you find out you got it wrong sometime later. But how do you erase that processing? How do you extract that memory from your brain of that clever idea you just thought up? So inviting learners to think about wrong answers does not seem pedagogically sound to me. Whereas, at least with concealed multiple choice questions, they think about their own answer first. Not only that, but the system collects what learners think the answer is, and so you can do something with that data. And then asking them to say which is closest. Now, your questions would be a lot more complex than these, of course, but if you're actually getting the students to think about which is the closest answer to their question, then there's a bit more chance they won't be processing the wrong answers so much. And with the constructionist approach, it's only the learner's answers you're thinking about. And in the context of systems, you can get the student to keep trying to create that goal, to find the right answer to that goal, to hit the ball through the net. So what does the theory mean for scenario-based learning? I think it means we have to think about those alternative forms of feedback that promote iterative processing for learning. And then sharing these examples. Well, this is incredibly important because this is how we learn from each other. And we've developed a couple of tools to help with this. The course resource appraisal modeler, I'm not going to go through, but it is about the model, I don't know if you can read that top line. It's about modeling the teaching costs and learning benefits of any type of course. And the point about this is that with digital methods, they're always very expensive at the beginning, but there's a payoff later. And it's very important for academic managers and financial departments to understand that if you invest up front in digital learning, you can get a good payoff with far more students using it in the end, and it producing much higher learning benefits. And that's the trade-off we should be looking for. Not whether it's cheaper, but whether the cost of producing and delivering that teaching matches or is increased by the learning benefits you get throughout. And then the learning designer tool is a way of enabling teachers to represent their design, their learning idea, and then share it with others because it's a digital object. Going back, this design is one where in class, the students are working together to join the class voting on answers to the decision question in the clinical simulation. And then they make a note of the issues that they're uncertain about. So what this has done is to embed that scenario-based simulation in a learning design for a whole class session, which I got from the MOOC, which has been created. A beautiful MOOC, beautifully designed. And just looking at one of those examples, which is a lecture-based use of scenario-based learning, and the students loved it. Okay, now, thinking back to what scenario-based learning can do in the digital, in terms of the conversational framework, if we put just multiple choice questions in, this is what could happen. We've got this nice exercise, it creates a task, the student makes a selection of what their decision is, and it provides feedback on what happens next. But the next thing they have to do is then answer a new task, make another selection, and they'll get feedback on that. And the next thing they have to do is make another selection, and they'll get feedback on that, and so on. And the difficulty is there's nothing much going on for the learner, possibly. The problem is that every time they made a decision, they've got a lot of stuff to read, they've got to see what's happened to that, and now you've got to make a new decision. Now, at what point do you reflect on the quality of that decision? So, suppose we wanted to embed that in a better way, so that when they're doing this class voting and they just see what happens next, what happens next, what happens next through that linear process, we're now going to create a new one. And we can see we've got this same kind of beginning where we've got, they have a practice element, so this says it's online, and then they're using the tool again when they go online here and when they go online at home. But this time, the practice element is a bit different. It says, with your partner, link to the simulation and work through the first question. Look at the feedback on what happens. So just doing one question. Why is this the best answer? Decide whether to proceed or make a different decision. Make a note of the issues you're uncertain about and work through the next question. So they're actually working together on thinking about just that first decision. And then the teacher is reflecting on the answers which they've all been given, because I'm assuming they've got some kind of dashboard and they can see what everybody else is doing, and then summarizes the key issues that relate to medical ethics. And then there's a further stage where on their own at home, as one person working for 30 minutes at home, but online, they go back to the simulation, use your class notes to work through the questions again and make notes of what it takes to get it right and why some answers are wrong. Make a note of your reflections. So what all of that is doing is trying to get more of that activity there. So in this pie chart, there's a lot more production and practice. There's a small amount of face-to-face in comparison with the online. And the teacher is present again for part of it, but there's a lot more group activity than there was and a lot more individual activity because we've stuck that other bit on the end. Now that's lengthened the total learning time, but it's constructed what the learner should be doing. Okay, so the idea is to think in terms of how you build the learning design around what the scenario has in order to ensure that the student is encouraged at least to do that kind of analysis and reflection. And then you can use something like MOOCs to share all of that, and the blended learning MOOCs that we did on FutureLearn alongside the one that you got on FutureLearn. We got over 25,000 teachers over the last couple of years using that. And that's a lot of people to be able to get to. You get the video update. This is one on dementia. It gives you a video of whatever the new approaches are. You get dynamic links to those tools, and you get a lot of very good discussion going on because these are professionals talking about how do we best do this kind of scenario-based learning. Then you can get them to share their designs. And so the Padlet wall is a lovely, just a perfect digital online pinboard, really, where you double-click and you put on a link to your learning design and description of it, maybe a picture, something like that. And this is where, by sharing learning designs, we can get people to peer review each other's. There'll be hundreds of these, but the system can pair up individuals and say, now review each other's work. And that peer review process among professionals is akin to what we do in research, where we never just go and do stuff by ourselves. We go and see what other people have done, and then we experiment with it, and then we contribute it back to the community. It gets peer reviewed, and you get a gradual building of knowledge across the whole community. That's how we do science. But the science of learning is so complex now. So hard to do. We've got to share that out. So having something like that process is going to be very important. But it's not going to be papers in journals. It's going to be something like, here's a learning design that works for us. Now you try messing with it and making it better. So I think what this means is that when we're thinking about sharing exemplars, which is precisely what this network is doing, if we can do it in a way that allows us to build on the work of others, yes. But we must also use it to create that opportunity for peer review, for improvement. And what does improvement mean? Those criteria that come from the theory. So we share the burden of innovation, we collaborate to build the knowledge about scenario-based learning. Again, it's what this network is designed to do, exactly that. So I think by being able to share through these sorts of tools, which encourage us to think about just how good is this learning situation, experiment with it, and then share it back and say, look, these are the kinds of results I got, that's going to help us with that knowledge building. So to summarize, I think the theory-based design means it gives us a means to encourage iterative processes, something to think in terms of as we're thinking about how to design the learning. What does it mean for scenario-based learning? I think it means thinking about alternative forms of feedback, going beyond multiple choice, and I know that people are doing that, so that's very important, and thinking about what that means for how the student is processing that knowledge and experience. And then using these kinds of tools for the collaborative knowledge building, which is going to enable us to find out how best to use scenario-based learning. So I think it's fantastic. I think the work that's been done here is wonderful. And being able to do that together is going to make it even better, which is what the network can do. So congratulations and thank you.